Why neurodiversity matters. These are some things that I'm learning as an autistic therapist. Some background, first of all. I'm Sonny Hallett. I'm a person-centred and outdoor therapist based in Edinburgh, and I'm autistic. I'm also trans and mixed race, and I grew up bouncing between China and the UK. Before training as a therapist, I was, and I still am, deeply involved in the autistic community and the broader neurodivergent and disabled communities. I co-facilitated support groups for people coming to grips with their autism diagnosis in adulthood, and I co-founded and chaired AMAZE, the Autistic Mutual Aid Society Edinburgh. Over time, I encountered a huge number of autistic people who had either struggled to access mental health support despite being in crisis, or access support only for it to be unhelpful or actually worsen their mental health difficulties. I also went through my own mental health struggles during this time, and I encountered a lot of the same challenges. So, for example, services and professionals saying, well, you're autistic, so we can't do anything for you, or the services being inaccessible, or the support provided lacking an understanding of neurodivergence in a way that was really unhelpful or even damaging. I was also able to access some very transformative and helpful therapy. I ended up leading some research with AMAZE into autistic people's experiences in accessing mental health support in Scotland, and then later autistic people's experiences of talk therapies, to get an idea of what was going wrong and whether there are any patterns. You can see both of these reports from AMAZE's website. You can also read some of my more personal reflections on difference on my Medium blog. It was that curiosity about what was going wrong, and also no small amount of frustration and anger, that first got me into counselling training. I got into training because I was angry. I wanted to see what was happening in training that could be leaving so many autistic people and people from minority groups unhappy and hurt by their counselling experiences. I also realised that there was so much that I'd learned from neurodiversity, from the autistic community, from disability activism, that actually enriched and clicked with a lot that I was learning about person-centred theory and more broadly about counselling. Over time, I experienced ideas and approaches that might actually be partly responsible for what was going so badly wrong, but also ideas that could be massively helpful. I also discovered that counselling is something I really love. So let's talk about what neurodiversity is and make sure we're on the same page around the terms neurodiversity and neurodivergence. Neurodiversity describes the diversity of different kinds of minds in a population. Much like an environment like a forest can be biodiverse if it contains lots of different kinds of life, a population can be neurodiverse if it contains many different kinds of minds. Too often, neurodiversity is mistakenly used to refer only to neurodivergent or neurominority individuals with distinct diagnostic labels. So, for example, folks with ADHD, people who are autistic, people who have Tourette's, so on. Or worse, neurodiversity is used to refer to an individual who can't be diverse because they're one person. Neurodiversity is about all of us. So, neurotypical and neurodivergent, neuromajority and neurominority, those who experience the world in ways that are more similar to those around them, and those who have less similar experiences. And just like with biodiversity signalling rich, healthy environments, different ways of being enrich us all. It gives us access to different ways of understanding the world and ourselves. So why learn about neurodiversity? A common and very valid question I get, particularly from other person-centred and humanistic therapists, is, well, this is all very well, but why should I learn about neurodiversity specifically, rather than just take each person's ways of being as they come, without any preconceptions? For me, the answer is the same as why I think it's important for us to do any other kind of diversity training or other specific CPD. It's not about learning what every autistic person is like, or what to do when you work with someone with ADHD. It's not about what to do with us. It's about taking every opportunity to expand our imaginations and sensitivities towards different ways of being, so that we can be more aware of our own internal judgments and beliefs about the world, and the limits of our experience. It's also about having some starting points to go from when we meet new people, and being able to hold that information, but hold it lightly, so that it's not on those in minority groups coming to counselling to do all the work explaining the basics, like what a meltdown is, or that lights could be overwhelming, and smells can hurt. Also, when the only narratives around us reinforce a specific set of more neurotypical experiences, it can be very hard to understand, let alone explain what's going on for us, even at a very basic level. So, to give a personal example, like a lot of autistic people, I have an auditory processing difficulty, which means that I really struggle to follow a conversation when there's other noises going on. So for years and years, I would go to places like cafes and pubs, or even be in school, and feel utterly alone and overwhelmed by the sea of voices and noise, while everyone around me seemed fine, they could all hear. And because this wasn't a thing that other people understood or ever validated, I understood it the only way I could at the time. I internalized it as something that was wrong and bad about me, that, clearly I didn't care enough about other people, otherwise I'd be able to hear them. I'd try to hear, and then I'd berate myself for not hearing. It was only when I met other autistic people and learnt about auditory processing difficulties that things fell into place. So now I ask to go somewhere quieter, and I say outright that I can't hear when there's too many things happening at once. Without learning about others' experiences, I had no starting point for understanding what was going on for me. I didn't even know it was possible, even when it was something I experienced for myself. There's no way I would have been able to explain this to anyone. Just think about how much human experience might currently be beyond our wildest imaginings, whether we experience them ourselves or not. The core conditions. So for the rest of this piece, I hope to share with you some of the key things I've learned and the ways I've approached and understood counselling, particularly person-centred theory, through my own background of being part of neurodivergent communities. It almost feels like I've come from this other space where we often understand and do things differently, and I'd like to share with you a bit about how the counselling world looks from over here. I'm going to frame the next section of this talk under the headings of the three most commonly discussed core conditions: empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard or acceptance. So, empathy. Empathy was a worrying theme for me when I first entertained the idea of counselling training. Not because I didn't think that I was empathetic, but because the myth of autistic people not being empathetic is still far too prevalent. I was worried that it could become a barrier for me in my training, and unfortunately at times it did. Also, almost my entire social world at that point was made up of autistic people. I worried that I might not be able to connect with people who are not autistic, or who are more neurotypical, especially given my experiences of being utterly baffled by social rules and expectations, or of being told that I just didn't understand, that I'd gotten it all wrong. What I learnt when I first started counselling training was a revelation. We are all getting it wrong, all the time. When we don't check in on a feeling, a meaning, an expectation, there's no guarantee at all that we'll be right. It's just that some of us have majority experiences more on our side than others. When my counselling training and a lot of other trainings and CPDs went online because of COVID, many people were understandably thrown by the new situation. They said, what are the new social rules? When is it my turn to speak? How do I know if I'm doing it all wrong? It was quite strangely refreshing for me, I found, to be in a non-autistic space where everyone was suddenly asking the same questions and had the same uncertainties that I'd had in all social situations all my life. Suddenly everyone had to negotiate. Everyone had to check. Nothing was obvious and there was no agreed neurotypical norm. During this time, I thought quite a lot about the double empathy problem, an idea that's been a really big part of my thinking and learning about neurodivergence and difference. The double empathy problem is coined by Damien Milton, an autistic academic. So to quote Damien, in simple terms, the double empathy problem refers to a breakdown in mutual understanding that can happen between any two people, and hence a problem for both parties to contend with, yet more likely to occur when people of very differing dispositions attempt to interact. Within the context of exchanges between autistic and non-autistic people, however, the locus of the problem has traditionally been seen to reside in the brain of the autistic person. This results in autism being primarily framed in terms of a social communication disorder, rather than interaction between autistic and non-autistic people as a primary, mutual and interpersonal issue. Primarily mutual and interpersonal issue. The double empathy problem in the context of cross-neurotype communication is strongly supported by studies such as one conducted by the University of Edinburgh's DART Lab, who I've collaborated with. They carried out an experiment where a story was delivered from one person to the next, like in a game of telephone, along 3 chains of participants known as diffusion chains. So one chain was all autistic, one all neurotypical, and one alternating between the two. The first 2 chains performed about equally with how much information was lost by the end of the chain. The mixed group performed very notably worse, with the most amount of information lost. Similar studies also show higher levels of rapport within same neurotype groups compared to much lower rapport in mixed groups, and this is both self-reported rapport and observer rapport. It's also important to think about all this in the context, I think, of unexamined privilege and power. If someone's experience of the world is more similar to the majority, their guesses about others' experiences will be right more of the time. They might come to believe that they're an especially empathetic person as a result. Those more different from the majority might come to believe, and indeed be told throughout their lives, that they are unempathetic or bad at understanding others, that they need to try harder. Really, everyone needs to try hard to understand those who are different from themselves. But those who believe themselves to already have it, that being empathetic is already a part of their identity, rather than a continual effort and process to strive towards, might struggle more with those who challenge that identity by not being so easily understood. So what might this look like for people coming to counselling? Autistic people in our research on talk therapies talked about being told that they were not engaging when they were trying their utmost to engage, about being dismissed for not communicating their feelings in expected ways, about being invalidated around their experiences or disbelieved because they were not emoting in more typical ways. One respondent from our study said, "When I talked about how I felt, the counsellor told me I was detached from how I felt, presumably because I am autistic and wasn't performing the correct behaviours to signal genuine feeling. I started to really believe I must be completely detached from my emotions, even though I was experiencing intense emotions, and what I wanted was the tools to cope with them." I meet a lot of neurodivergent people in my work and daily life who really struggle with using emotion words, for example. I struggle with them myself a lot of the time. It can be to do with the difficulty in sensing our internal states and trusting those senses, but it can also be about the language. For me, partly, I want to be accurate when I tell someone something, or I risk being misunderstood, which in the past has had really dire consequences. So often the emotional categories just don't cut it for me. How do I know when I say that I'm sad that you will be imagining the same sadness, or anything close? What if how excitement feels for me isn't something that's within the limits of your experience up till now? Excitement can be frightening. Anxiety can be oddly comforting. People who struggle with emotion words might come to counselling worrying that they don't have the words and will be told that they're doing it wrong. Perhaps that's already happened to them. Offering to throw out that vocabulary can be liberating. It can be a relief. I did a lot of drawing as a kid and worked for a long time as an illustrator throughout my 20s and 30s. For me, that was a way of conveying feelings more accurately than feelings words allowed, and allowed me sometimes to try to communicate what was going on when even no words were available. As I got into my counselling training, I noticed that the speaker and I were often able to reach a closer understanding through exploring images and metaphors, whether that was something that described the feeling I was picking up, checking if it felt accurate, or an image that the speaker was using. So I want you to imagine anxiety. Imagine anxiety coming in waves, for example. But what kinds of waves are they? Are they crashing waves that are loud and overwhelming, threatening to sweep you away? Or endless swells that just keep washing over, exhausting you over time? Are you a beach, or a rock, or a tiny crab caught in the swell? Are you absorbing the wave's energy, or is it smacking hard against you, or tossing you about? These images, this whole multi-sensory world, whether it's based solely on imagination or literally from the scenery around us, especially if we're outside, don't carry the same vague individual baggage, well, they of course still do carry baggage of emotional vocabulary, all the majority understandings and expectations that come with them. I've also found that other neurodivergent folks are often the ones who are most excited and enthusiastic about using imagery and sensory metaphor, bringing this massive richness and a sense of playfulness to our work together. This is definitely not me saying just use metaphors with neurodivergent folks, and lots of autistic people can really struggle with metaphor. But I am suggesting that maybe using language that's couched in neuronormative expectations might not always be helpful when trying to bridge that double empathy gap, which does to some extent exist between all of us. In Carl Rogers' words, empathy is to sense the client's private world as if it were your own, but without ever losing the as-if quality. Perhaps doing that as accurately as possible can involve creating a shared and multisensory language in each relationship, rather than insisting on one where the power and norms of communication might be seen to, or does, lie with the therapist. A lot of this is to do with the fact that expectations between two individuals can vary wildly, and also that empathy isn't magic, but we're too often, I think, tempted to believe that it is. To frame empathetic connection as magical, or something some people have and others don't, can be deeply disempowering for someone with a minority experience of the world who might have already been taught all their lives that their experiences aren't real. Because none of this is magic, and expectations can vary at the most unexpected times, one of my favourite and most valuable learnings from all of my counselling training is that nothing is ever too obvious to state. My own counsellor put this beautifully in his own approach to his work. He said, "I try to never surprise anyone. By stating what we're noticing or our intentions in the moment, we not only remove a potentially stressful variable or uncertainty, but also, I think, model that it's okay to not know, and it's okay to be clear. So now when I walk across the room at the start of a session to close the door properly, I say that's what I'm doing. At the end of an outdoor session, I state which direction I'm heading in and suggest where we say goodbye. We take ownership of our actions, rather than leaving the other person to guess, potentially feeling like they should just know." While we all have all kinds of expectations about other people, I think my own weirdness, on a personal note, has meant that I've never quite known what to expect of other people. In the past, I saw this as another reason why other humans are just baffling and inaccessible. It's been incredibly empowering for me to realise that I can ask, and because I don't know what I'm supposed to expect, I may be less surprised by the answer, potentially helping to invite a more complicated and congruent response. For example, this is an example from my own recent personal experience. A friend asked me, "You had to cancel the party you were so looking forward to. How was that?" I said, "Everyone thinks I should be really disappointed, but actually I'm relieved. I wanted to see everyone, but the idea of seeing them all at once was overwhelming, and now I get to catch up with each of them separately." Let's talk about congruence. So this kind of leads on to congruence, really, because congruence is connected with stating what's happening for us, what our expectations might be, and being real in all of that. I got really excited about the concept of congruence when I was first introduced to it, because it provided a language for the realness that I've always craved and deeply appreciated from those around me, and also my fear of incongruence, because it could hold potentially dangerous unknowns. As a child, I was very afraid of incongruence. I was afraid of masks and heavy makeup and people putting on voices, and I can still find those things quite unsettling at times. Many autistic people and other neurodivergent folks and those who've experienced interpersonal trauma, there's a big overlap here, can be particularly sensitive to possible incongruence and on the alert for it, while also being hyper-aware of aspects of our own incongruence, particularly the ways in which we might have had to contort our ways of being to fit societal rules and expectations, or to keep ourselves safe. Masking is a word commonly used now to describe in particular autistic people's experiences of pretending to be neurotypical. So suppressing stims, for example, which are repetitive movements that can be calming or regulating because of shame or fear of drawing unwanted attention. Or being less enthusiastic than we feel about an interest that others might see as unusual. So, for example, I grew up being fascinated by animal skeletons, and I loved to go to museums and sketch them. But I started pretending at school that they were not interesting and avoided talking about them, because my best friend told me that it was morbid and creepy. In many ways, being neurodivergent, or different from the majority in other ways, can be about being pushed constantly towards incongruence by those around us, by society, by our internalized messages, while being deeply aware of and distressed by it, because it's so far from our real selves. The pressure mounts until we disappear into ourselves and are stuck or burnt out, or until we explode into moments of distress in congruence with how wrong it all feels. I actually kind of think, in a way, that this is basically at the centre of all therapy. I think people rarely, if ever, come into counselling because what's going on for them is exactly what they and everyone else expected. People come to counselling because what they're feeling feels incongruent to themselves or to the expectations around them, or both. For example, I'm grieving but I don't feel sad. Maybe there's something wrong with me. I always assumed I'd want kids, so why does it feel so wrong for me now when I imagine it? I feel so happy and right in my gender identity, but my family believes that I am wrong and confused, and that's making me doubt myself. Rogers talks about the counsellor being in a state of congruence and the client in a state of incongruence. But I wonder how much the roles in counselling itself can create expectations and pressures to mask for both parties. I talked earlier about people coming to counselling fearing doing counselling wrong, or being told that they weren't engaging or weren't suited to therapy. At the same time, we as counsellors might feel all kinds of pressures to appear professional, to hide our surprise or confusion, to seem calmer or more together than we might actually feel. When the context of therapy itself exerts its own unexamined norms and expectations, the relationship can suffer because neither party can be fully real within it. And the more different we are from the average, the more we might feel that pressure to contort ourselves to fit, whether we're the counsellor or the client. What feels really important here, to me, is for us to constantly be asking ourselves why. Why do we do this? Why is this expectation here? Why don't we do this other thing? Alongside that asking, I think we should also be more aware of our own moments of masking as counsellors. Is this really me? Or is this a professional mask so that I can appear more competent or composed than I'm feeling? Being real can be messy, it can be scary, and it can be awkward, just like how real life is messy and scary and awkward. And I think it's a real mistake to try to make counselling slick and tidy. Being real for me personally as a counsellor means being kind of awkward and being open about being autistic and open about anything else about me that's relevant to the relationship and the context. Being explicit about what's happening. For example, I might get distracted by a noise outside or get internally sidetracked processing something a client has just said. I might try to describe that out loud, even if it feels kind of awkward, taking ownership of what's happening for me rather than leaving them wondering what just happened. In my own experience as a client, I've always felt far safer with counsellors who, when they make mistakes, can openly talk about what happened, with all the awkward messiness that might come with that, as long as they're also taking responsibility for their feelings and able to bring that sense of holding, even if it was lost for a moment. Because then I know that they're not likely to be hiding anything, and that I don't have to guess. To myself, and I think to many neurodivergent people for whom incongruence can be frightening, a counsellor who is overly slick and professional, or just silently withholding, can ring serious alarm bells. I think sometimes, particularly as person-centred counsellors, we have this idea that because we don't want to direct or influence our clients, we hold back on bringing too much of our real selves into the space. Or we come to believe that silence is always inviting, because for us as professionals who know how to use that space and find it familiar, maybe it does feel inviting. But couldn't this be a sort of power move in itself? Built on a familiarity with the space and format that the person coming to counselling is far less likely to have. Some of the respondents in our survey talked about finding the openness of non-directive counselling intimidating and even quite alienating, that silent pressure to talk. I personally strongly identify with the person-centred approach, and I think of myself as pretty non-directive. But I think it's important to reach out a hand into the space which might be completely alien and frightening to those we work with. I think we can make the non-directive quietness feel safer by actively inhabiting it as ourselves, rather than hiding ourselves for fear of being too much. Imagine you're sitting on a log by a fire, and you want to invite someone to sit down next to you and share the warmth. I feel like surely the inviting thing to do is to show that you're enjoying the fire while moving aside to make space on the log, rather than retreating into the shadows and staring at the empty log expectantly. Likewise, I think we should share openly how we are using the counselling space and how the client might make use of it. Sometimes I start with inviting folks to share, to talk with me about the room, whether there's things that can make it more comfortable, such as changing the lighting, or opening or closing the window, or moving the chairs. Outdoors, I might mention that sometimes my joint condition means that I'll have to avoid certain routes or use a stick, but that I'll tell them about that so that they don't need to make it their responsibility. But also that they might also say if something isn't manageable or comfortable for them. It becomes part of an ongoing collaboration and negotiation, which I believe could lead to a collaborative and hopefully more equal therapeutic relationship, and one where taking the risk of being more congruent might feel possible. Unconditional positive regard. So finally, let's talk about unconditional positive regard, often also tied in with acceptance. A big chunk of my thoughts around all this comes from disability activism, support, and also my own experiences of having been helpfully and sometimes unhelpfully supported. To me, a big part of unconditional positive regard is about trust, which I think in a disability context is linked with the idea of presuming competence, to work on the assumption that a person has the capacity to grow, develop, and figure out what they need. To feel unconditional warmth towards someone means, to me, trusting in their complete personhood and the idea that everything they're feeling and doing makes sense in that person attempting to survive and grow. And that me trying my best to really understand and empathise with that, to really feel it so that I can reflect it back to them as it is, could maybe help make things clearer, less intractable, or less blocked by shame or judgment. And then maybe change can happen. Far too often, neurodivergent people and other disabled people aren't trusted to make our own decisions, or others don't make the effort to try to understand why our decisions, our actions, or feelings make sense. We aren't presumed to be competent. Even now, we often get depictions of autistic characters on TV who seem just completely unrealistic to many in the autistic community, because the non-autistic character never tried to understand our motivations. They just aped our behaviours. This is where I think it's important to learn about different forms of neurodivergence, but also to be aware that a little knowledge, wielded clumsily, can be a really dangerous thing, and that we need to stay in touch with our realness. Our research suggested that counsellors who don't know anything, or know very little about autism, might fare mostly middlingly with autistic clients, while counsellors who claim to know a lot about autism inhabit the extremes. The respondents reported their sessions going either really well or really badly. It can be too easy to know that autistic people might have unusual and intense interests and then not really try to understand what that can feel like for an individual or why something is so interesting. It can be equally easy to dismiss something as ADHD-related distractibility without delving into what that might mean for the person's world and how that might colour their motivation. As Rogers put it, to be effective, the therapist must use empirical knowledge only to enrich and enlarge his subjective self, and must be that self, freely and without fear, in his relationship to his client. I think it's vitally important that we don't let the fear of the potential preconceptions that learning about specific groups might give us become a barrier to learning and expanding our subjective selves, our understandings and our sensitivities. Ignorance only reduces our preconceptions by accident, and doesn't help us to re-examine ideas and beliefs that we already hold, that may be unhelpful or overly limiting, hidden unconsciously within all of us. If we can use our learning to challenge ourselves and better understand where we are situated in the world, within systems, and in contrast to or alongside others, rather than as some kind of rote guides to place over another person's experience, I think we can all become better and more reflective, sensitive, and empathetic practitioners. I've encountered and I'm surrounded by a lot of neurodivergent people who feel both out of control and not trusted because their feelings and actions aren't understood by others and aren't a part of any nuanced and realistic popular narratives. Every April, a thing comes around known as Autism Acceptance Month, which many autistic folks actually dread. It used to be more popularly known as Autism Awareness Month, which I think was worse because awareness is really the bare minimum. But to me, this acceptance isn't much better, because again, to quote Rogers, acceptance does not mean much until it involves understanding. Too often in Autism Acceptance Month, and when we talk about acceptance as helping professionals, it feels like it's this passive thing we can just throw over something like a cloth to cover up a messy sofa, so we don't have to look at it anymore. Real acceptance, I think, comes naturally as a result of active attempts to understand and empathise, and alongside that, for me, also often comes unconditional warmth and trust. The second part of that acceptance quote from Carl Rogers goes, "It is only as I understand the feelings and thoughts which seem so horrible to you, or so weak, or so sentimental, or so bizarre. It's only as I see them as you see them, and accept them, and you, that you feel really free to explore all the hidden nooks and frightening crannies of your inner and often buried experience." I remember going to an autism service in Edinburgh where I'd been lucky to be supported by some wonderfully understanding and warm humans. I still didn't understand much about autism then, and I didn't know much about the things I struggled with. I was very distressed. I was barely able to speak, and close to meltdown, and furious at myself for not being able to just get on. One of the support workers came into the room and said, "You're just stuck." And then he said some other things I don't remember exactly, but that communicated to me that he really understood what the stuckness felt like, and it's not bad or wrong to feel like that, and that it's real. I can still remember what it was like to feel so understood and accepted in that moment, but also trusted, in the sense that he didn't view anything I did as nonsensical or irrational. Sorry, you're probably hearing my dog walk across the room here. It was all congruent to my experience of the world. I was able to relax a little and look at my own stuckness and distress with more understanding and curiosity, and even start to accept myself in that feeling. Eventually, I could explore more openly what might help. If I can trust that a person is working with what they have at the moment and responding to the challenges that they're experiencing, I can also trust that with the right support, warmth, and space to grow, they will get to where they need to go, and that this might not look anything like where I would go, or what's expected, or the norm. I've talked a lot about neurodivergence throughout this presentation, and often specifically about autism, but I don't want you to go away thinking that all of this is just about working with neurodivergent people. For myself, I found that the things that seem to be helpful for many autistic people are often helpful for everyone I work with, whether more neurodivergent or more neurotypical. Maybe sometimes it's less needed, but no less valuable. It can help make our practices more accessible for many people. The more I try to learn about and understand many different ways of being, the more I also seem to notice the subtle but important things I might have overlooked in those who are more similar to me, or even in myself. It enriches every part of my work, and it enriches my life and my understanding of myself, and gives me access to new perspectives. I hope that some of my thoughts on counselling and difference that I've talked about here today might give you some slightly new lenses through which to view things as well.